afternoon to you all, and thank you all for coming. 146 years ago today, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, later called Mahatma Gandhi, was born in Gujarat, India. As Indians and India observers know, October 2nd is celebrated all over India as Gandhi Jayanti, as it was today. While Gandhi's economic legacy has dramatically faded in contemporary India, an erosion that began under the leadership of Nehru, his trusted lieutenant, his social and political legacies continue to inspire. For example, environmental ideas have been arguably at the core of many environmental movements and driven a lot of non-governmental organizations. Indeed, the NGO movement in India is one of Gandhi's greatest social legacies. I use the term socially advisedly. The number of NGOs who swear by Gandhi is enormous, truly enormous. What about Gandhi's contribution to what might be called the strictly political field? I'm clearly making a distinction here between non-governmental organizations and politics, a distinction that can be made, but may not be under certain other circumstances. His contribution to India's freedom is so great that even his most fervent opponents of the time have had to accept that he is the father of the nation in a way no one else can be or is. He might be a difficult father, but a father nonetheless. We were having this conversation, and students of mine who've been in my class know that I often say that even lousy fathers can be difficult, but great fathers are certainly difficult because they demand so much of their children. India's current Prime Minister was reared in an organization which always resisted and critiqued Gandhi. Mr. Modi, however, has accepted Gandhi as modern India's greatest figure. He's said so now several times. Whether it is an act of genuine ideological conversion, at least in part, not wholly of course, or as a pragmatic concession remains unclear. But even if it's the latter, namely a purely pragmatic move, it shows how even Gandhi's ideological others have had to acknowledge the debt India owes to the man. Otherwise, there would be no need for a pragmatic concession. Gandhi's core political idea, of course, was civil disobedience or non-violent resistance. Our speaker today has made some original contributions to the discussion of civil disobedience. The distinctiveness of his work lies not in a philosophical exploration, that's my view, philosophical exploration of the idea of civil disobedience, as much as a truly remarkable account of how non-violence is planned and mobilized in political practice. How a theory is put into action. I invite you all to read his chapter, the Salt March, in his book. The exact title is Mahatma Gandhi, Nonviolent Power in Action, a book I have used for the last 20 years in my class. And because how well it analyzes this idea, a theory put into action. What kinds of organizations, what kind of organizing is needed when you put this difficult idea of taking blows and not responding violently. Taking blows and not responding violently into practice. Other than that famous book, Dalton has also been associated with The Sources of Indian Tradition, the most recent volume. It's a source for all of us, one of the most important sources for understanding Indian tradition, as well as how the tradition lasted and in what form in modern times. He has been, for most of his professional life, the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia, and he retired from there in 2008, has been Professor Emeritus since then, and living not in New York City, but in Oregon for the last 4 or 5 years. He will discuss Gandhi's place in India's overall intellectual discourse, and if I understand correctly, in particular Gandhi's relationship with Ambedkar, a very important issue for our times. So please welcome Professor Dennis Dalton.
We were discussing my book, my Gandhi book, over lunch. And I must say, after a discussion with Professor Varshney, no author could expect a more attentive reading. I had to search my own mind to remember some of the details that he mentioned in our discussion. So I treasure your comments. Thank you. And I am most grateful to be here today. I'll talk for perhaps 50 minutes and then look forward to the Q&A afterwards and to invite your questions. I've called my talk, as Professor Varshney has just indicated, Gandhi at the Center of the Modern Indian Intellectual Discourse. And him being at the center is particularly felicitous today because of his being today this 146th birthday. The word discourse in the title refers to the remarkable way that modern Indian thought represents a vital exchange, a virtual contest of ideas among prominent political leaders during the nationalist movement. Whether the discourse was sometimes charged with acrimony, as between Gandhi and B.R. Ambedkar, or with eloquence, as Gandhi's exchanges between the great poet and himself, Rabindranath Tagore, these diverse, vigorous debates remain rich and informative. As we gain more perspective on the discourse, its contours and substance increasingly illuminate its significance. And we've referred to, Professor Varshney has referred to the publication in paperback at least, just 2 weeks ago, of the latest 3rd edition of Sources of Indian Traditions in paperback, and I'll be glad to discuss that with you if you wish. This edition tries to capture the vibrant conversation that went on among these leaders of the nationalist movement. I refer you especially, you look at it, to chapters 4 through 7, especially chapter 6 entitled Gandhi and Responses, which I've attempted to resurrect the vibrant nature of this conversation or dialogue or debate among these leaders. As an actor with magnetic force, Gandhi interacted at the center of this dialogue, deeply rooted in it. He drew from both its ancient and its modern sources. Ancient in the context of his religious heritage, and modern from within the nationalist movement itself. This lecture is structured around ideas that concern prominent nationalist leaders and thinkers who, with Gandhi at the center, shaped the discourse. The focus is on a single word, Swaraj, usually translated as freedom. The particular problem addressed here is how to unpack and contextualize what may be called Swarajism, or the Swarajist way of thinking. That is a continuing process of both personal and political liberation, leading at best to a spirit of what Gandhi and Ambedkar alike identified as boundless empathy, or maitri. As we'll see, the concept of self is crucial for Swarajism, meaning self-realization, yet also self-restraint and self-sacrifice. This theory of Swarajism starts with how the term was conceived by Indian nationalist leaders in the early 20th century. It proceeds with their various interpretations of a single text, the Bhagavad Gita, and I conclude with a summary statement of the significance of Swarajist thought. Throughout the narrative, Gandhi's contribution is, of course, as I said, featured. The modern Indian idea of freedom dominates the discourse. It commences with Swami Vivekananda in the late 19th century and then soars through the writings of the next 50 years of Indian political thought, prominent especially in the political theories of Aurobindo Ghosh, Bipin Chandra Pal, B.G. Tilak, Rabindranath Tagore, B.R. Ambedkar, and after Gandhi with Jayaprakash Narayan and M.N. Roy. The concept of Swaraj, as I said, usually defined as freedom in modern political thought, must nevertheless be distinguished from our common understanding of freedom in at least three ways. First, in the Vedic texts, especially in the Rig Veda, and then in the Tarva Veda, Swaraj initially signified self-ruling chiefly in a political sense. For example, a king, including even Indra, the king of gods, possessed Swaraj, it was said in the Rig Veda, as in sovereignty over a dominion. And yet Swaraj also had another meaning in ancient Indian thought. The Chandogya Upanishad, for example, specifically states that, quote, one who has pleasure and delight only in the soul possesses Swaraj, or unlimited freedom in all worlds. Therefore, from the outset, Swaraj had this dual meaning of political and spiritual freedom. Second point about Swaraj is how it assumed this duality of political and spiritual in modern Indian thought. The word was initially introduced to the nationalist discourse in the sense of its political meaning. And this was when Dadabhai Naoroji pronounced it as self-government in his presidential address before the Indian Nationalist Congress in 1906. Bipin Chandra Pal, a leader and theorist of the extremist faction within the Indian National Congress, seized on Naoroji's pronouncement of it and ran with it, enlarging it to combine elements of personal and political, spiritual and ethical emancipation. The lectures that Pal gave in Madras in early 1906 are historic. They conceptualized Swaraj by reconstituting it in its dual sense, as well as connecting it to ideas of Swadeshi and passive resistance. Swadeshi translates as one's own country, and therefore it signified reliance on Indian rather than foreign materials. This included boycott of British goods. Following from this, obviously, the doctrine of passive resistance. All of these ideas formed a nexus of thought forged by Pal and other extremist leaders before Gandhi even entered the Indian scene. Pal merits special attention because he's often ignored when in fact no one spoke about Swaraj in the early 20th century with greater oratorical power than Bipin Chandra Pal. So I offer here an ample sample from Pal's Madras lectures on Swaraj. These were delivered 2.5 years before Gandhi developed the idea with mixed similarities. The following then is from his Madras lectures in 1907. This movement of Swaraj is not a mere economic movement, though it applies to the solution of the great problem of Indian poverty. This movement is essentially a spiritual movement, since it has its application in the social, economic, and political life of the sublime philosophy of the Vedanta. It means to carry the message of freedom because freedom is man's birthright. So are you, prince or peasant, Brahmin or pariah, man or woman, Hindu or Mohammedan, Buddhist or Christian, rich or poor, ignorant or learned. You are inherently free. And this freedom is not want of restraint, but it is self-restraint. Freedom is not want of regulation, but self-regulation. Freedom is not want of determination, but self-determination. And it is only consists in members as members of a free state. We shall be able sooner or later to realize the end that this new movement has set up, namely that of Swaraj. We shall achieve our goal of Swaraj through means of passive resistance, that is, of boycott. With this comes, of course, national education. This teaches us to build the movement up from our village life. I said that our philosophy comes from the Vedanta, but the Indian nation is not a Hindu nation, nor a Mohammedan nation either. Christians, Parsis, Buddhists also form a large part of our population. When we speak of Swaraj, we talk of all these groups who belong to this land. The future people of this Indian nation will not possess one religion, or one social code, or submit to one particular set of social or ethical discipline. Swaraj means a federated nation. It means we have our own history, our position that is unique in the world. Now, this speech took a long time to deliver, because what I've omitted from the speech are the extensive periods of applause after virtually every line. This man was an extraordinary orator. And Bipin Chandra Pal deserves, as I said, far more attention than he did, than he has received as a dynamic, forceful leader of the extremists before Gandhi emerged. The words from Pal, and this is our important point, provide the essential elements of Swarajism. Other extremist leaders soon supplied more, until just the mention of Swaraj served as the war cry of the militant faction of the Congress. Aurobindo and Tilak seized on it. Tilak's mantra in May 1908, that Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it, coincided at exactly the same time with Aurobindo, a prominent extremist who insisted that the nation must have, quote, unqualified Swaraj, or self-liberation of the people for the final fulfillment of the Vedantic ideal in politics, the true Swaraj for India. Now, the last point relates to Gandhi's theory of Swaraj. Gandhi came notably late in his reference to Swaraj. He didn't mention the word at all in his writings until as late as January 1907, when he briefly praised Nauroji's speech. But Gandhi conceived of Swaraj here only in a political sense. Within 3 years, a radical development in Gandhi's thought occurred. This critical change of thinking happened during his crucial visit to London in 1909, when he encountered Congress extremists directly for the first time. Fresh from his formative experience with civil disobedience in South Africa from 1906 to 1909, after, he actively engaged Indian terrorists who vigorously preached a violent ideology of independence. Gandhi's response was historic and electric. The first sign of it can be noted as he was about to leave England to return to South Africa in October 1909. Gandhi then gave a lecture entitled Ethics of Passive Resistance. Here he confronted Bipin Chandra Pal for the first time in London. Pal reacted critically. In fact, he severely criticized Gandhi's position by contending that Gandhi's sole force, as he calls it, must always be backed by physical force when necessary. Gandhi replied to Pal at this point just as sharply that whenever violence enters the Swaraj movement in any form, it would quote, not deserve the name of satyagraha or soul force. Now, as we'll see, Gandhi's position here accurately forecasts the core element in his controversy with Pal and Tilak later. It introduced into the debate, for the first time, the vital theory of the means-ends relationship that Gandhi will feature in his most important writing, famously entitled In Swaraj. This classic was composed at white heat while aboard the ship voyage back to South Africa from London in November 1909. So this was less than a month after his confrontation with Pal. And it was also composed to satisfy questions and criticisms from a close friend of Gandhi, Dr. P.J. Mehta, my good friend. Professor Sriram Mehrotra has written an entire study on the relationship between Gandhi and P.J. Mehta, and Gandhi later said in 1940 that he composed In Swaraj as a response to his friends, as P.J. Mehta's criticisms. In Hind Swaraj, Gandhi didn't mention by name the Congress leaders at all. He only referred to the two Congress factions of moderates and extremists, directly then refuting their positions. His innovation in Hind Swaraj was to take the extremist position a crucial step further in terms of theory and method. He did this not only by forging the political with the spiritual meaning of the word. Pal and Aurobindo had both argued that 2 years earlier. What Gandhi introduced was, of course, the theory and practice of satyagraha. Gandhi started by telling the moderates bluntly that their approach was impotent, since their reliance on endless petitioning would get the movement nowhere. It needed active resistance of the sort that he himself led in 1906 with civil disobedience against apartheid in South Africa. More consequentially, though, Gandhi moved to what he saw as the fatal flaw of the extremist case. That is, their admission that if the method of passive resistance or boycott didn't make the Raj yield, then they, the extremists, would be prepared to proceed to violent action against it. Gandhi categorically rejected that as a viable approach for both moral and political reasons. It couldn't work, he declared, because violence gave the moral high ground to the British, and violent means would corrupt the end. Gandhi's dictum, "We reap exactly as we sow," appeared first here in Hind Swaraj in 1909. This signaled his core theory of the logical relationship of means and ends, consistent with his interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita that we'll turn to in a moment. The closing paragraphs of Hind Swaraj sum up the new idea of freedom that Gandhi contributed to the nationalist discourse. Real Swaraj, he stated at the conclusion, is self-rule in the form of self-control. The way to it is satyagraha, that is truth force. Satyagraha has been translated in a number of ways. Gandhi himself translated it as truth force, soul force, love force. In my book, I simply call it nonviolent power. Therefore, he continues, in my opinion, we have used the word Swaraj in a wholly different way, without understanding its real significance. I have endeavored to explain it as I understand it, and my conscience testifies that my life henceforth is dedicated to its attainment. The significance of Hind Swaraj cannot be overstated, and it's justifiably received ample attention by a number of Gandhi scholars. As an ideological proclamation of independence, its meaning for anti-colonialism is evident. In philosophical terms, the theoretical connection forged between Swaraj and Satyagraha has been indicated by James Tully, a well-known philosopher, in his book, Public Philosophy in a New Key. Tully perceives perceptively explains it, quote, as a meditative relationship of working truthfully on oneself and one's attitude to improve how one conducts oneself in the challenging yet rewarding civic relationships with others. Once again, I commend this book to you by the Canadian philosopher James Tully. His book, Public Philosophy in a New Key. As it happens, James Tully is being celebrated now in Yale as I speak. That is, this book and his other works have been chosen for special attention, not because of his writing on Gandhi per se, but because he has become a leading philosopher on the subject of citizenship. The point here, in the context of the intellectual history of the nationalist movement, is how Swaraj clearly forecast Gandhi's response to both sides of the Congress and the debate between them. That is the stuff of this exciting discourse. That is how well it served him in the decade between 1909 and his rise to power in India with the Satyagraha campaigns of 1919 to 1922. He deftly stole the thunder from the extremists by laying claim to the Vedic tradition in his own reconstruction of Swaraj. Yet he went further by contending that their admission of violence as permissible only emulated the West, whether by following the terrorists of the Irish Sinn Féin movement or by the British suffragettes. The extremists demanded action, and Gandhi gave it to them through the novelty of Satyagraha. At the same time, the moderates' objection to violence was overridden by Gandhi's assertion of principled nonviolence. So in one stroke, Gandhi advanced a discourse that had been stalled within the Indian National Congress by paralyzing factionalism, divisiveness over a right method of action. Swaraj thus meant more than Nauroji, Pal, Tilak, and Aurobindo had conceived. It carried the traditional meaning that Pal had revived, but Gandhi's Swaraj gave the movement Satyagraha. Passive resistance, then, was transformed by Gandhi into the entirely novel idea that India's freedom could be gained only through strict nonviolence in word and deed. The extremists hadn't anticipated the consequent power of seeing Satyagraha or nonviolent action in this way, and so they were eclipsed quite dramatically by 1919 by Gandhi when the movement really took off. It took off 4 years after Gandhi returned to India from South Africa. Naturally, there was immediate resistance to Gandhi's method of Satyagraha from those allied with Tilak and Powell. Annie Besant, for instance, a remarkable woman who was everywhere, it seemed, in the world in terms of resistance movements at this time. She was president of the Congress, Indian National Congress, this Irish woman, in 1917. And she was also a prominent member of the entire extremist camp. Her criticism of Gandhi at this time is memorable. She declared, Gandhi doesn't want Swaraj, he wants suffering and more suffering. Aurobindo joined in this criticism by characterizing Satyagraha as, quote, getting beaten with joy. Gandhi's dramatic and final break with the extremists didn't occur until January 1920, when Pal and Tilak refused to support his non-cooperation campaign because of the demanding, exacting requirements that Gandhi attached to Satyagraha. Therefore, in placing his resolution before the Congress, Gandhi stated emphatically that their method, that is the extremist method, was emphatically not consistent with his. Mr. Pal and Mr. Tilak, Gandhi declared, represent a definite school of thought opposed diametrically to ours. They consider that everything is fair in politics. We join issue with them in this conception of political life. We consider that political life in India will become thoroughly corrupt if we import Western tactics and methods. We believe that nothing but the strictest adherence to nonviolence, that is to honesty, fair play, forgiveness, can advance the true interests of this country. This is the essential difference between us. Now, from this followed Gandhi's theory based on his idea of means, ends, of the core opposition of satyagraha to passive resistance, or what he called, leaving behind the term passive resistance, duragraha, that is clinging to bias in a bad cause by using wrong methods. Duragraha denoted the counterfeit of satyagraha because it was corrupted by its implicit allowance for violence. Some say, Gandhi remarked, that, quote, means are after all just means. I would say means are after all everything. As the means, so the end. Violent means will give violent Swaraj. That would be a menace to the world and to India itself. Now, this sharp antinomy that Gandhi insistently draws throughout between satyagraha on the one hand, that is pure nonviolence, and duragraha on the other, that is mere passive resistance that's usually corrupted by wrong means, wrong methods, as well as wrong-sighted goals. It's distinguished and refined by his means ends theory, giving the nationalist movement a solid theoretical pillar. Gandhi stated this clearly and emphatically. To quote Gandhi, 1920, satyagraha differs from passive resistance or duragraha as the North Pole from the South. The latter has been conceived as a weapon of the weak and does not exclude the use of physical force or violence for the purpose of gaining one's end. Whereas the former, satyagraha, has been conceived as a weapon of the strongest because it excludes the use of violence in any shape or form. And now we turn to a discussion of Gandhi's reading and use of the Bhagavad Gita. This shows how he enlarged and illuminated the idea of Swaraj. His unique interpretation of the Gita captured, on the one hand, the philosophy that Tully perceives as, quote, a meditative relationship of working truthfully on oneself, while on the other, it emphasizes and incorporates the Gita's concept of karma yoga, that is, the yoga of action and of selfless action. Gandhi consistently maintained that the Gita served as the major spiritual influence on his life. His exegesis of the text, by far the longest and most detailed that he gave to any single writing, includes a treatise entitled Discourses on the Gita. This was delivered in a series of lectures that he gave to members of his ashram from February to November 1926. And it's evident from this text alone that his use of the Gita is central to his thought. As he says repeatedly, this is the source that he returns to until the end of his life as a fount of inspiration and consolation in both political and personal respects. So these discourses on the Gita comprise no fewer than 217 lectures, 282 pages in his collected works. And in the final lecture, Gandhi concludes with a sense of reluctance that he's come to an end. He quotes, the quote is, "My enthusiasm for the Gita," he told his ever-eager ashram audience, "grows day by day. When we began, I agreed to talk about the Gita and explain its meaning because I like the idea, but now my pleasure in the discussion has grown since I started. I get daily more absorbed in it, and one gets the impression at lecture 217 that he could have easily gone on for another 217 lectures. His enthusiasm for not just explaining the text, but relating it to the daily life of his ashram, that's the point, and it increases with each lecture. Examples abound throughout these lectures of how Gandhi insistently applied the Gita to everyday conduct in his ashram, in this case in the Satyagraha ashram. His basic premise, and this cannot be emphasized too much, was that since the ashram must be the model or the microcosm for the nationalist movement, lapses in moral behavior in the ashram betrayed the whole country's cause. For example, when someone was said to complain about cleaning latrines because of qualms over caste prohibitions, Gandhi sharply determined that, quote, Sri Krishna would tell him that he was betraying his dharma, that he would lose his good name, that people would forever talk ill of him, because the Gita taught equal dignity of all without regard to caste. Furthermore, the Gita's idea of yajna, or self-sacrifice, dictated the sanctity of manual labor in particular. Gandhi declared that, quote, man simply cannot live without such work. Gandhi caste prejudices, contradict the value of bread labor, as Gandhi liked to call it. Therefore, corrupt traditional practices of caste or untouchability cannot be tolerated within the ashram. And there are all sorts of stories about how Gandhi is fighting with everyone over this, including his own wife, about cleaning latrines or performing other practices that are deemed often beneath caste status. If the ashram, he insisted, can't exemplify these reforms, then the country has no model to follow. One particular lapse of behavior in the ashram so concerned Gandhi that he made it a running theme throughout the discourses. This is the struggle between possessiveness and detachment. For instance, when an ashramite was distressed over the theft of his personal property, Gandhi didn't choose to make this an issue of thievery in the ashram. Rather, he criticized the victim's distress as a symptom of wrongful possessiveness or detachment. It's striking in this regard how Gandhi featured this as the central lesson of the Gita, that is, to learn detachment from all possessions. In these discourses, he connects virtually every major idea to it, always starting with attachment. It breeds a host of sins, beginning with craving that leads to anger, enmity, lust for power, every aspect of selfishness. Where there is possessiveness, he said, there must be violence. We should think that the things we keep in the ashram belong to others as much as to us, and so remain indifferent towards them. The other way is the way of violence. Krishna, always going back to the Gita now, Krishna tells Arjuna to give up any possessiveness. If we blame the thieves and regard them as very wicked men, we would be filled with rage and want to kill them. Attachment gives rise to anger, and anger clouds a man's vision so that he loses his judgment and forgets who he is. We should concentrate our attention on the means. If they're right, the end is as good as assured. We can follow the truth only if we shed our attachment to the ego. It is to teach us this that Sri Krishna has advanced this beautiful argument of the Gita. This should be the ideal for the Satyagraha ashram, that we may see light when all around us is darkness. As in our body, so is the universe. Otherwise, we cannot win Swaraj. If we can achieve self-realization, then self-realization necessarily implies Swaraj. So you see, there's this long discourse, a lecture, and always it infuses ideas from the Gita, because these are discourses on the Gita, but almost always it comes back to the central notion of Swaraj. It should be evident that Gandhi was just fascinated with the Gita because of how he could construe multiple meanings from it that comprised his whole nexus of ideas. The Gita became the basis of his whole program of social reform, his theories of satyagraha and Swaraj, of the necessary relationship of means and ends, and this must not be missed, his concept of anti-colonialism. Because the Gita represents India's special meaning to the world, special message to the universe as it combats colonialism. The cravings, the possessiveness of modern materialism, the hatred, the brute force of imperialism, they have corrupted the original meaning of civilization as good conduct. Good conduct, of course, being sudaro and not kudaro, the idiotic conduct of the West. He often concludes then with his reference to Swaraj because it connects conceptually with anti-colonialism. Now, throughout the discourses, he refers to the text as an epic poem, and he himself saw himself as deeply involved in the art of poetic interpretation. Gandhi never wrote a word of poetry himself. He wasn't much moved even by Rabindranath Tagore's Nobel Prize poems. And yet, he could assert that the power of the Gita lies in that the poet's meaning is limitless. He claimed that, quote, after 40 years of unremitting endeavor, I've tried fully to enforce the teaching of the Gita as a great religious poem. The deeper you dive into it, the richer the meanings you get. So with every age, the important words will carry new and expanding meanings. He concludes tellingly that, quote, the seeker is at liberty to extract from this treasure of the Bhagavad Gita any meaning he likes, so as to enable him to enforce in his life the central teaching. Now, this last claim deserves real emphasis because of what it reveals about his Swarajist way of thinking. As we've seen, leading thinkers of this nationalist movement featured the idea of Swaraj long before Gandhi developed his interpretation of it. Gandhi's originality lay in the way that he incorporated the Gita into his Swarajism. 10 years after Gandhi delivered the discourses on the Gita, he reflected back on his mission. He said, what I have done is to put a wholly new interpretation upon the entire teaching of the Gita and the very spirit of Hinduism, giving new meanings to Karma Yoga, Sannyasa, Yajna, etc. This has breathed new life into Hinduism. Now, this claim might seem extravagant, but in a certain respect it can be substantiated. We return now to the first lecture in the discourses. This is crucial because he revealed here his allegorical interpretation of the Gita. This came with his contention that the great epic poem was not, as it might appear, an account of an actual historical battle. It is rather a profound metaphor of a moral struggle between forces of good and evil, nonviolence and violence within each of us. The Gita as allegory was meant to inspire then an internal contest within us. Our ethical duty, which he stresses duty over and again, is to undertake this inner strife. And note especially how this is emblematic of his Swarajist way of thinking because it insists on his quest for inward freedom. One of his favorite terms. Inward freedom achieved only through psychic struggle. That's my term. Or using another metaphor, Gandhi declared that, quote, the pilgrimage to Swaraj is a painful climb, an arduous inner ascent. We're reminded here further of Gandhi's advice to a nephew who has asked Gandhi how to work for Swaraj. Gandhi replied, and these words are pearls of wisdom from a Gandhian point of view. Quote, he tells this nephew, emancipate your own self first. This burden is very great indeed. Apply everything to yourself. In your emancipation is the emancipation of India. The Gita became, in Gandhi's allegorical interpretation, the indispensable guide to first self and then national liberation. Richard Davis has honored us with his presence today. He has analyzed Gandhi's view of the Gita splendidly in his recent and your original biography of the Gita in a segment, among many others, entitled Gandhi's Nonviolent Gita. Richard, I had concerns that in this terrible weather you somehow wouldn't show up for Barnard College, but you blessed us with your presence, and I am deeply grateful because I'm going to ask you to comment on this further in our discussion. The value of Richard Davis's study for our purpose is that he not only gives a lucid and succinct explanation of Gandhi's interpretation of the Gita against its classical antecedents, but he also places it in the context of contrasting interpretations by major leaders B.G. Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, Aurobindo Ghosh. The contrasts are sharp and instructive because they enter into the ongoing conversation discourse that presents the Gita as at the magnetic center of a rich then dialogue within the nationalist movement. This narrative shows Gandhi's striking originality by fulfilling his claim to, quote, put a new interpretation on the whole teaching of the Gita and the meaning of Hinduism. This point is well made in an extensive review of Richard Davis's book entitled War and Peace in the Bhagavad Gita. The review is by a well-known scholar of Sanskrit and Hinduism, Professor Wendy Doniger. Doniger opened her review with a question, and the question was this: how did Indian tradition transform the Bhagavad Gita, the soul of God, into a Bible for pacifism when it began life sometime between the 3rd century BC and the 3rd century CE as an epic argument persuading a warrior to engage in a battle? Indeed, a particularly brutal, lawless internecine war. Now, we might note that Doniger's point is not new. Barbara Miller, my former colleague at Barnard College, and from my point of view, the gentlest, most compassionate Sanskrit scholar that I've met, contended in the afterword to her translation of the Gita in 1986, a widely available translation you may know in Bantam, that, quote, Barbara said, the Gita is not a justification of war, nor does it propound a war-making mystique, as Mahatma Gandhi knew when he read it. I had the honor of discussing this at great length with Barbara Miller, and I take her point of view emphatically. Doniger, however, moves the argument further than Barbara does in her afterword by explaining how Gandhi's voice emerged as prominent in this focused conversation about this single text. Gandhi's prominence seems improbable, after all, as advocate of nonviolence, directly opposed to the contrary exegeses of Aurobindo and Tilak. Moreover, Davis and Doniger mention in this contest of interpretations another figure whom Professor Varshney mentioned. That's B.R. Ambedkar, by far Gandhi's most vocal and vehement critic. Ambedkar, renowned untouchable leader and theorist of his community, offered a telling indication of the distance between him and Gandhi when he referred to the untouchables consistently as Dalits, rather than as Harijans, children of God. Ambedkar deemed Gandhi's term and Gandhi himself as an upper caste patronizing Hindu, and he chose Dalit or downtrodden as far more moralistic than Harijan or child of God. The Bhagavad Gita provided a characteristic lightning rod in Ambedkar's fierce controversy with Gandhi. It's evident that Gandhi liked metaphors. For him, the Gita represented both an oceanic poem, the deeper you dive into it, the richer the meanings you get, as well as a majestic ship or a boat. Gandhi quoted Sri Krishna's divine voice in the Gita in the midst of these discourses. The quote is, "Even if you are the most wicked of sinners, you will cross the sea of darkness and ignorance with this ship of knowledge, the Bhagavad Gita, in your hands." Gandhi then said, after commenting on Krishna's comment in the Gita, he said, "For me, the Gita is the ship." And we look forward to, by the way, Richard Davis's next book, which, titled Boat Over Troubled Waters, will focus on this entire discourse, using the Gita as the key. It was for Gandhi the ship over troubled waters because it gave his whole life safe passage over the most turbulent seas. Davis brings us to the point of conflict between Gandhi and Ambedkar through his account of Ambedkar's position on the Gita. Ambedkar would have none of Gandhi's metaphors or allegorical interpretations. For him, the Gita presented a rationalization of the Vedic caste system, a defense of inequality and exploitation of Dalits especially. And then, again, quoting from Richard's book, at its core, Ambedkar asserted Krishna's teaching aimed to supply a divine foundation for the Brahmanic, hierarchical social order. Now, if we return to Wendy Doniger's question about how the Gita became a Bible for pacifism, it certainly wasn't due to Ambedkar's interpretation of it, nor did it come from Indian nationalists before Gandhi. In 1908, Aurobindo, for example, declared his militant interpretation of the Gita. Aurobindo wrote, "The sword of the warrior is as necessary to the fulfillment of justice and righteousness as the holiness of the saint. Therefore," Aurobindo concluded, Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, God created battle and armor, the sword, the bow, and the dagger. Not long after this, Aurobindo was put in prison and finally escaped to go to Pondicherry, where he spent the rest of his life. Now, there's no hint of allegorical nonviolence in Aurobindo, nor is there any hint of it in Tilak or in Lala Lajpat Rai or the other figures. This came solely from Gandhi, and it further defines his Swarajist way of thinking, because Gandhi, in contrast to others, presented the Gita, as we've seen, as a parable of inner struggle that carries the seeker to a higher level of individual consciousness, thus contributing to India's emancipation. At best, proper study of the Gita liberates one from delusions of domination, from lust for power, from anger, from hatred. In this regard, it gives us Swaraj and Satyagraha in its pure sense, as rule of self through an internal form of conflict resolution and path to spiritual freedom. In fairness to Aurobindo, we might say, Aurobindo did later, as Richard points out, change his interpretation of the Gita substantially, although Aurobindo still rejected Gandhi's allegorical meaning and advocacy of nonviolent action. The political implications of Gandhi's use of the Gita became clear in the nationalist movement. As Richard Davis aptly concludes, quote, "For the Indian activists allied with Gandhi, the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita would define and reinforce the disciplined practices of nonviolent karma yoga at the center of the struggle for Indian independence." Now, in conclusion, Gandhi achieved a radical paradigm shift in Swaraj's thought. He first redefined it, and then he connected it to, all importantly, satyagraha. He insisted that only the strictest adherence to nonviolence could mobilize the masses effectively and gain Swaraj. Unlike any thinker or leader before him, he demonstrated the viability of a method that didn't merely unite the Congress, but completely transformed its method, its mission, its program. The example of the Gita serves to illustrate this. It provided the central allegory for a new way of conceiving the freedom struggle. Against Tilak and Aurobindo, who saw the Gita as a sanction for violence, or Ambedkar, who insisted on its historical justification for Hindu domination, Gandhi came up with an entirely original idea of it. The point, though, is not just its originality, but that it follows logically from his distinctive Swarajist way of thinking about internal struggle as a path to personal and political freedom. Emphasis needs to be placed on how this path demanded a right form of ethical action. As we saw early in his political career, Gandhi grew impatient with the moderates because they were a faction of inaction. He equally rejected the extremists for pursuing wrong-headed action. From Hind Swaraj, his first treatise, to his last writings, Gandhi insisted that his method was all about action. He said, "Action is my domain," in 1946. And the imminence of India's civil war increased his sense of urgency. He concluded in 46, "The world does not hunger for shastras. What it craves and will always crave is sincere action." The Gita worked for him because it satisfied this craving. This is why he regarded karma yoga, the Gita's yoga of action, as the core of the text. There are several important thinkers whom I've not touched on in this analysis. Vivekananda, who inspired Gandhi; Lala Lajpat Rai, who, like Pal, Tilak, Aurobindo, contended with Gandhi; Vinoba Bhave, Jayaprakash Narayan, M.N. Roy, who outlived Gandhi with their own distinctive ideas about freedom. These noted figures reinforce from one perspective or another aspects of the Swarajist way of thinking. Above all, in terms of earnest, engaged discourse with Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore reached Gandhi most deeply. Tagore definitely had serious differences with Gandhi. Yet when he spoke of Swaraj, Tagore used similar language. This is from Tagore now. "They who have failed to attain Swaraj within themselves," Tagore asserted, "must lose it in the outside world too. The real place of Swaraj is within us. The mind and its diverse power goes on building Swaraj for itself. As everywhere else, Swaraj in this country has to find its basis in the mind's unfoldment of each individual." As we listen to Tagore's language, it's evident how profoundly the conception of Swaraj resonated through modern Indian political thought. When Gandhi wrote in Hind Swaraj, "It is Swaraj when we learn to rule ourselves," he expressed a distinct way of thinking about political and personal emancipation the notion of independence became transformed into Swaraj, a philosophy of social self-cultivation. And then with Satyagraha, a dynamic mode of political and social action. The originality of Gandhi's interpretation of the Gita provides an illuminating case in point, especially as it complements and reinforces the Swarajist way of thinking with its connection to Satyagraha. The cumulative result is a powerful Indian idea of freedom. It's a theory that is first grasped within the nationalist discourse, yet it moves beyond it as well. Through this approach of comprehending how Swaraj evolved and its ultimate consequences, we may appreciate its significant contribution to the entire literature about the philosophy of freedom. Thank you very much for your patience. And,